everyone gets so tied up in knots about grammar. I know that's probably a little bit controversial, but you have been lied to about grammar. Welcome back to the StoryLearning podcast. My name is Ollie Richards, and this is the podcast where I talk about all things language learning. So if you have a question about your own language learning, if you want to ask me for some help or some advice on reaching your language learning goals, hey, well, you can get that here. You can submit questions to me here on the podcast, on YouTube, comments on the YouTube channel, or just by emailing us at StoryLearning. Any way that you want to do that is cool. I have been doing this podcast for 10 years now, and it is my favorite thing in the world to get questions from you, from people who are out there learning languages, who want to make that change in your life. Give yourself the gift of learning a new language. And if I can do something to help, then that is a job well done. So welcome to the podcast. And we're going to be talking about grammar today. And grammar, I got to say, of all of the topics in language learning, which are most widely understood, most widely abused, and time wasted, hair lost due to frustration, then it's got to be down to grammar. Because I've got to say, for the most part, and this phrase is overused, but you have been lied to about grammar. Virtually any traditional path that you've gone to learn grammar, to learn a language, whether that's through a textbook or a school or a teacher or whatever, it puts grammar front and center. It puts grammar in the foreground, and it makes grammar study seem like it is the job to be done to learn a foreign language. But the reality is, it is just one tiny part, and it's not the most important part, and it's certainly not the part that you should actually start with when you learn a language. But everyone gets so tied up in knots about grammar because that's the stuff that's taught. So I'm gonna give you a little pep talk today about grammar, and I'm gonna tell you why I don't think you should study grammar almost at all at the beginning, and you should focus on something else instead. So we'll get to that. Let me tell you a quick story about grammar. One of my best friends in the world, his name is Tomás. He's from the Canary Islands. I met him when I was living in London, and I was at music college in London. And he's a bass player. I was studying piano, and so we often played music together. It was a very cool friendship that was all based on music. Now, Tomás, bless his heart, his English was not very good when I met him, and he didn't really care to learn English either. He was there to study music. And so at the beginning, when I first met him, we spoke English just about, but I was, being a language guy, I was just in my early stages of becoming interested in language learning at that point. So I said, hey, you're Spanish, you're cool, you're a musician, we're friends, I'm going to learn your language. And so he was one of my first, not the first, that's a story for another day, but he was one of the first people who inspired me to go off and actually learn Spanish. So I did my thing, I applied myself, and after 2 or 3 months, my Spanish was better than his English, and so we started speaking Spanish at that point, and that was one of the reasons that I kind of got on so well with Spanish in the early days. But we would go out around London every night to pubs, to bars, concerts, parties. This guy was the most sociable, popular, funny guy in every single room that we were ever in. He would walk into a room and would have tons of friends within half an hour, within 5 minutes. And he would have people in stitches as well, rolling on the floor with laughter, literally. He was one of the funniest guys that I've ever met. And all of this in spite of the fact that his English was useless. And if I were to single out one part of his English that was really not that good, it was, can you guess? That's right, it was his grammar, because he'd never really studied grammar, or he maybe studied it, but he hadn't really got his head around it. But what he was able to do was walk into a room, stand in front of someone, take the measure of the person right away, use body language, eye contact, and the vocabulary that he had to communicate with them on a human level right from the beginning. And this is a skill that most people don't even have in their first language. In fact, often, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but often in your first language, you can get very kind of tied up in knots socially because you are so aware of the nuance of every little word that you say. Right? If you say something in a particular way, you're hyper aware of the tone, how that might be interpreted. And so, it's possible to get quite socially anxious because of language and the need to take care of how you speak and the impression that's given when you say certain things. None of this is an issue when you're speaking a foreign language, because you know that you don't know all that much. You've got to use very simple, almost like Tarzan speak to communicate. It can be a real confidence boost because you can kind of give yourself permission not to be particularly articulate in the language. And this is entirely the case with my friend Tomás. He had zero hang-ups about his use of language. And so instead, he focused entirely on actually communicating. Really something amazing to watch. And, it was life-changing for me to watch that, because that made me realize that whenever I was learning a foreign language, I didn't need to wait until I was perfect to be able to make friends. I'd seen him do it over and over again. And so that one of the reasons that I think I've been able to make a lot of friends in the languages that I've learned is because I very deliberately have not waited to be good enough at the language before I start communicating with people on a human level. I was so grateful for that lesson. Now, many years later, I moved to Japan, and in Japan, people are not that communicative, right? It's difficult to make friends in Japan because, to make a very broad generalization, Japanese aren't particularly fond of foreigners. And so they are very reticent in their communication with foreigners. Not everybody, but on the whole, that is the case. At least it was when I was living there in 2010, and I've been back quite a lot since. I think Japan is opening up quite a bit, but I think still fundamentally, the Japanese are not the most communicative, expressive society, and you've got to really work hard. So as a result, what happens in Japan is that a lot of English speakers, or even foreigners in general who go there, they study Japanese, and they formally study the language. And so you'll sign up to a language school, you'll get a teacher, and you will really almost go back. It's like going back to school, really, right? You're treating the language as an object of study, and that's kind of your only option in a way, because it's much more difficult. The relations with Japanese people who you don't know are extremely difficult. I mean, even among Japanese people, like there's the concept of uchi-soto, which is kind of inside and outside, or people that you know and people that you don't. And when you're on the outside, there's a whole code of rules that you need to follow about social interaction. Anyway, what I noticed over and over was that foreigners who went to live in Japan would obsess over grammar. And there's all these grammar rules that get taught in the Japanese language schools and in the textbooks. And you see people, you can see them thinking, with their eyes kind of rolling, trying to process the grammar rules as they're trying to string sentences together. And over again, I would see people get hung up on trying to use the right grammar correctly. Whereas, as I knew from my interactions with my friend in London, if your grammar was 200% better, that is not going to help you in any way with the communication that you're trying to have with this person on the street right now. What is going to help you is learning to communicate with that person on a really kind of basic level, right? Whether that is eye contact, although in Japan possibly not, but you get what I mean. Empathizing with the person. So if the grammar doesn't help, then why is it taught? Well, the reason that grammar is taught everywhere is because it's the most user-friendly thing to teach. It's difficult to teach hundreds or thousands of words. Like, what are you going to do? Just memorize words all day long? It's difficult to teach eye contact and social interaction because that's kind of hard for everybody. It's difficult to teach listening comprehension in a classroom because what are you going to do? Just kind of sit there for an entire hour listening? So teachers and academics and textbooks default to teaching grammar because it's the most conveniently teachable thing. But it is only a tiny part of communication. As David A. Wilkins, who is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the University of Reading, said, without grammar, very little can be conveyed. Without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed. And that's the key point. Somewhere between 90 and 95% of all communication in a language is the words, the vocabulary. It is not the grammar. If I say, I tomorrow go shopping, centre, town, car, it's a garbled mess. but you understand what I'm saying, right? Even though there is absolutely zero grammar in there whatsoever. So with just a smattering of grammar, a smattering of knowledge of word order maybe, but a whole bunch of vocabulary, you can say an awful lot and your communication can go a long way. And so the thing we've really got to bear in mind is that as a beginner learning a language, it's not about the vocab. It's not what did I just say? It is not about the grammar. It's about the vocabulary. So I would focus almost all of my time as a beginner language learner on acquiring vocabulary. And how do you do that? You do it through listening and reading. You read short stories like the books I've got here that I'm currently holding upside down in a highly skilled manner. You can go through textbooks that have dialogues in there. You can listen to beginner podcasts or YouTube videos, but your main goal is to acquire as much vocabulary as you possibly can. And so if I'm in the middle of a language project, I will focus almost all of my time at the beginning on reading, on listening to easy beginner material, and I will focus on vocabulary. Often, I mean, I quite like to use flashcards to memorize, to learn and memorize phrases. I tend to not do that with single words, but certainly with useful conversational phrases. I like, I don't know, asking for directions or conversation starters or things like that. But I'm completely focused on vocabulary. Now, you can't ignore grammar altogether, and I'm not suggesting that you do. But the way that I tend to approach it is that if I'm working through a curriculum of some kind, let's say I'm going through a textbook, I'm going to be mostly focusing on the dialogues, all right? So this is either a little short story, or it is people having a back and forth conversation, like, which way is the train station? Oh, that way. That way? No, that way. Turn these silly contrived dialogues that you get in textbooks, but they're actually quite useful as a complete beginner because you learn the most common vocabulary. You're in your textbook or from your teacher or whatever it is that you're using to learn, you're inevitably going to come across some mention of grammar. And so what I like to do in this situation is I pay attention to what's being taught. I take stock, I take note. If there's a grammar rule there, I'll read it. But I'll stop there. And what I won't do is sit down and do a whole bunch of exercises. My goal is to understand and get a sense of how the grammar is behaving. Notice how it's being used in the stuff that I'm reading or listening to. But then moving on and carrying on with the reading and the listening, getting that all-important input. Because if you think about it, what's the point of grammar exercises? I know you're used to them because that's what you get at school, but why? Why do we have grammar exercises? The reason they're there is because it's based on this outdated notion, and it is outdated, that if I give you a grammar rule and then you practice that enough, you will then be competent at that grammar rule and you will be able to speak fluently and rule the world and live forever. But it doesn't work like that because grammar rules can only be taken on when you're mentally ready for it. Manfred Pieneman, who came up with this thing called learnability theory and processability theory, said you can only learn a grammar rule when you're mentally ready for it. And even then, I would say the rule, it's kind of an artificial thing because a rule is, all you can ever really do with grammar is describe the way that a language behaves. You can say, okay, we tend to say this, right? You know, in English, we tend to say, I did my homework. But there's plenty of native English speakers who will say, I've done my homework. Now, is that wrong? Technically, grammatically, yes, but people say it. So what about the rule that says, I do, I did? Is that still valid? Well, not really. It turns out it's not really a rule in the first place. The correct way to learn grammar is not by memorizing rules, but by noticing how language is used out in the real world and then learning from that. Because that way you learn the reality of how grammar is used. You learn the rules, you learn the exceptions to those rules, and you get a much more realistic view of how the language is actually used. So for me, you know, from the beginner stage all the way up until pre-intermediate or even intermediate stage, I'm really not doing much more than simply looking at grammar rules when they come up, noticing them, taking stock, and then moving on. Where it becomes really quite important to study grammar is from an intermediate level onwards. Okay, why? Because when you've got to an intermediate level, so B1, maybe B2 at a push, At this point, you're able to converse in the language. You know enough to be able to hold a conversation, to be able to understand. And the pathway from your intermediate stage through to more advanced stages involves two things. It involves, firstly, learning a lot more vocabulary. That never stops. But it also means starting to master grammar. And so what I will often do is learn a language by myself up until an intermediate level. And then I'll start working quite intensively with a teacher in order to just start to really help me get my head around the grammar, notice my mistakes, help me iron out my mistakes and do stuff and proceed on that basis. So to put it really simply, I'm doing no more than noticing grammar and having a brief read of grammar rules from the beginning all the way up until intermediate level. And then from that point onwards, I'm taking grammar quite seriously. And I'm taking grammar especially seriously once I would get to an advanced stage, so C1 and above. Because at that point, really, it's going to be very weird if you know lots of vocabulary, but your grammar's all skewy. So it just becomes more important at later stages. Now, one of the most common objections to the way that I've described it here is, what about a language with really hard grammar? So what if you're learning a Slavic language, for example? And the way that I think about this is that I do think there's probably a case for maybe paying a little bit more attention to grammar of very difficult languages in the early stages. But I still don't, but I don't change my basic position. And the reason is because of the story that I told earlier about the foreigners moving to Japan. If, let's say that the grammar of a language is really, really hard, if you obsess over that grammar and you try to study even harder because it's really difficult grammar, so you've got to study it hard. If you try to do that, you're just going to end up more and more and more obsessed with the grammar, and you're going to not do all the things that you need to do in order to get good at the language in the first place, which is all of this input for the listening and reading, and it's acquiring vocabulary. That's the stuff that matters. So are there some concessions to be made for languages with hard grammar? Well, maybe slightly, but I still wouldn't say, I wouldn't do what a lot of people do, which is go on a kind of 2-year grammar learning expedition. Because if you do that, I guarantee you will never emerge the other end, because you're going to be so obsessed with grammar that you're going to be too scared to speak, lest you get one of your verb endings wrong or whatever. So anyway, that is my approach to grammar. I know that's probably a little bit controversial, but so much of, when it comes to learning a language, so much of your success comes down to your mindset and your ability to steward your own learning, not just to sit there and say, teacher, teach me, but to take control of your own learning and to say, I'm aware of the progress that I'm making in my languages here, and I'm going to take control, and I'm going to do more of the things that I think I need, even though my textbook is telling me something else. Now, if you would like a little bit of help with grammar, then I have a free downloadable resource for you, my grammar and vocabulary study sheet. Now, it took us many years to come up with this elegant name for this lead magnet, grammar and vocabulary study sheet. So here's what it does. It's a very simple PDF that you can print out, and it's just got space for you to write down things like vocabulary or full sentences that you want to learn, so complete phrases, and little explanations for the grammar within those phrases. Right. So, for example, if you have a particularly useful, like I often learn my grammar from phrases. So I'll learn a phrase that's useful for me, depending on my situation and where I am, and then I will notice the grammar. I'll say, okay, cool, I've learned that phrase, and look, there's this little bit of grammar going on inside the phrase. I want to remember that, and so I will deliberately study that little bit of grammar in the phrase that I've just learned, because it's practical, it's contextual, it's useful. So in this printable sheet, what you can do is you can write down words and phrases, and then you can just make a note of the grammar explanations, and it just allows you to keep track of the most important information that you're coming across, so that you can access it easily later. You can download that by going to the link in the description, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening in a podcast. That is it for today, and I'll see you back for the next episode of the Story Learning Podcast.